Hi everyone, Becky here at the National Quilt Museum, talking today about joining our round 3 Block of the Month Club blocks into the final quilt top. You can see I've got my parts and pieces laid out here for the quilt as we talk about the tutorial today. And just a few reminders, we have been doing this round a Quilt As You Go method with each of our blocks. And so we're going to be kind of completing that into adding our sashings and joining all of those pieces together. Under the Files section on the Facebook group or on the museum's website, quiltmuseum.org, under Block of the Month, you can find the Round 3 Introduction Packet. It's a short document. It has some yardage amounts for the fabric required for our joining pieces, as well as a suggested layout diagram, which you are welcome to print out and help keep track of where you're putting each of your blocks in your different colors. It'll also send you to thequiltingedge.com, and that's where we're pulling our tutorial and our instructions for the Quilt As You Go method specifically for this round. Marianne there at the Quilting Edge has a great tutorial. She has photos that you can check out as well. We wanted to help complement and supplement some of her instructions specific to our block sizes and our layout through this video tutorial. So you've got lots of resources to help us get started joining all of these fabulous blocks together into a quilt top. There's a few terminology pieces I wanted to cover before we really dive into the stitching part of the tutorial. And that is, this technique is going to require front sashing pieces, back sashing pieces, as well as some batting, and it's a great way to use up your batting scraps with this technique as well. So be sure to check out those introduction packets. So let's get started. To focus on the first row, I've got my first 3 blocks here. And that way it'll be a little bit easier to showcase which pieces, which parts are coming together and where all of these different types of sashing pieces actually go. So I'm going to take some of these outer edges, kind of my outer longer borders, just a little bit to the side, so we're not going to worry too much about those pieces at the moment. What I want to focus on are these first 3 blocks and then what we're calling our front sashing. And I've got mine in all of these scrappy different colors. I like the look of the multicolor effect coming to blend in and a little bit create some different variety in the overall quilt design. So if you're using the same fabric for front sashing, that's fine as well. Just note that mine is a scrappy look. And when you get to the front sashing, we are cutting them a little bit different than normal. So these pieces are cut 12.5 inches wide, or long, 12.5 inches long, which is the same size of our block, so they'll match this length. And then they are 4.5 inches wide. And this method that we see from thequiltingedge.com cuts wide sashings so that we can fold them in half, wrong sides together, and press them, just like we were making a binding strip. So we've pressed these pieces in half, and that way we'll have a nice finished edge when we go to put our final assembly of these sashing pieces together. So we have 2 inner front sashings. Both of these pieces have been folded in half, wrong sides together, and pressed so that they are the right size for our sashing. We also then have 2 outer front sashing pieces. Now these pieces are cut 12.5 inches long by 3.5 inches wide, but they are not pressed in half. So we've got a little bit of variety here. So those outer pieces we're just going to leave. Those are the outside edges of the quilt itself. So we'll just leave those off to the sides for the moment. So we have our front sashing pieces, which are folded in half and pressed, so they're kind of doubled over. And then we have back sashing, and I'm using this rainbow multicolor effect here. For the back sashing, I'm using the same fabric for all of my back sashing, just because I had enough of that sitting around and it kind of pulls in all of the colors of the quilt. So I have a single piece of back sashing, again cut to 12.5 inches long, so it's the same size as our block, and this is then cut to 2.5 inches wide. So it's half the size of the front sashing, but that's how we want it to come together. So to get started, we'll take the leftmost block from our row, and that's my first block here, and a piece of back sashing, an inner back sashing and one of my inner front sashing pieces that we just talked about. And I'm going to take the right hand edge of the block and kind of flip that over so I can see the back side of the block. I'm going to take my back sashing piece, right sides together, align it along that edge of the entire block. I'm going to put a couple pins in here just to help hold it in place as we get started. So I've got my back sashing right sides together with the back of my block, and then I'm going to fold that out again so we can see the front side of the block. And I'll take that inner front sashing piece. The raw edges of this piece go along the raw edges of the block. So not anything too crazy yet. And I'm going to put a pin through all of these layers. So it's kind of like we've just sandwiched our block between back sashings and front sashing pieces. We're going to stitch down that side with our 1/4 inch seam allowance, just as usual. Now that this piece is stitched, I'm going to pull those pins out. And now we have our front sashing that pulls apart. And then on the back side, this back sashing kind of fills in as well. So what I'm going to do next is press from the back side. I want to press this back sashing so that seam is nice and flat to come together. So we can see, press the back sashing. I've left the front sashing just kind of folded back onto the block for right now, because the fun part of this method is we join the second block in our row to the back sashing in order to start assembling our pieces and to keep the dimensions all together. So my second block here, again, I'm going to flip that partially over so I can see the back side of the block. Oop. And I'll take my back sashing and right sides together, line up the left-hand edge of the second block with my back sashing to go through. Again, I'm going to add a couple pins to help hold all of that together. So I've got the back side of my block with my back sashing ready to be pinned. So this time around we're just doing the back sashing to the back side of the second block, and then we're going to stitch that seam as well. So I've stitched this seam down. I'm going to remove those pins, and when I unfold the second block from the front, this is what you're going to see. One block with the wrong side of your back sashing facing upwards here, and then attached here. From the back side, we have 2 of our blocks with our back sashing pieced together. So we're going to give that a press again from the back to make sure this is laying flat from this seam. So of course with Quilt As You Go, we've been adding batting in between all of our blocks as we've been stitching them. And so now that our back sashing is attached to 2 of our blocks, we have this channel, this kind of groove here in the middle where we need to add some batting to help keep all of those layers even across the entire quilt. So this is where the batting scraps come in handy. You're going to want to cut a piece of batting that's going to be the same size here in between your seam allowance. It's about 1.5 inches wide. And even though the blocks are 12.5, if you round that up to 13, that'll, just in case anything shrinks or pulls a little bit with the batting itself, it's okay if that spills over a little bit from our outer edges on this step. We'll trim that in just a bit. So you can see that this batting scrap fits kind of right into this groove. I want to keep it between those edges of the seams and not overlapping, so it's the same thickness, consistency across the board. So we put that batting scrap in there, and now we take our front sashing piece that's just been hanging out here since the first step, and we're going to go ahead and press that over onto the block so it's going to cover our batting strip, and it's going to come all the way across to cover up our stitch line on the second edge. That's why we have folded these strips. We cut these front inner sashing pieces wider and fold them in half so that we have a nice crisp finished top edge so that we can stitch that down. So I'm going to make sure that it's covering all the way across my stitch line here And I'm putting pins in place to help hold that down. And what we're going to do to complete joining this sashing is just a top stitch at this point. So you can decide if you want to do a straight stitch. That's what I'm going to do on the top edge to make sure that this strip is attached through all of those layers. You could do a zigzag here if you like. If you're doing it by hand, you could kind of whip stitch it so it's like an invisible stitch coming down that edge. However you want to put that together, you can use your own designs there to go with it. I'm just going to do a straight top stitch right along close to the edge inside that front sashing piece to make sure that it sticks down and comes together. I may go back and add a second top stitch down the other side just so it looks similar, the same. That might just depend on how else I'm going to add my quilting into these details. When you're adding this top stitch, depending on what color strip your front sashing is, you may decide to change your color of thread since it is going to sit on the top. So be aware of that factor as well if you want something to blend in or to complement what other colors that you are using. So I have top stitched this edge down of the front sashing. So I've got batting on the inside. On the back, my back sashing is complete. My back sashing is complete across these two blocks to come together. And the final step here is now that we've attached the sashing, we've added the batting, we've kept that level consistent and added this top stitch down, we want to add quilting throughout this sashing strip so that it blends in with your other quilting. So you can decide if you want to make all of your sashings the same or all of your inner sashing designs, maybe just straight lines that come all the way down. Maybe you want to experiment with some other free motion, loop-de-loops kind of coming across, or zigzags with your walking foot kind of back and forth across, maybe something in circles that goes all around into that design. Whatever you would like to add in quilting into these strips, you want to go ahead and add that now. That way it'll help secure in those batting strips and really just help keep that look consistent across from one block to the next. If you're unsure what you want to do yet, you may want to join the next block, this row of 3 across, and then kind of work it in small batches. You just don't want to let it go too far unquilted because we want to make sure we can add all of our extra rows and those details appropriately to come together. So that's how you put your sashings together. When you're ready to add the third block as it comes across, again, we will have our 2 blocks, our third piece, our front sashing to go here. I've got a different color for this piece, and then a piece of back sashing again as well. So the method is the same. We're just adding it on to the next edge. So this right hand, this open-ended side of our middle block in the row, I'm going to fold that back about halfway. I'll take my back sashing piece and layer it right sides together with the back side of this block. I'm going to put a couple pins in there just to help hold it in place. And make sure that I've got those raw edges lined up. So then when we open up the block here, just like we did on the first round, I'm going to take this piece of front sashing and those raw edges and line them up along the same edge of the block. Again, creating a sandwich here with front sashing, block, and back sashing on the back side. And we're going to stitch down that with our 1/4 inch stitch. So I've stitched those layers of sashing through the second block edge, and I've pressed from the back of my block, that back sashing open. Now I'm going to take the third block in our row of 3, and just like we did between the first 2, I'm going to take the back sashing and set it right sides together along the edge of that next block. Make sure those are lined up nice and even. Put some pins through there, hold it together, Again, if you have a walking foot, an even feed foot on your machine, and you're able to easily use a 1/4 inch seam allowance with the walking foot, that would really come in handy with all of the layers that we are stitching together here to keep any crinkles or creases coming together. So I've added the 3rd block in the row to the back sashing. So from the back side, again, you can see this back sashing is added in between these 2 blocks. So again, we've got our back sashing added, and now we have this channel to fill with our next small strip of batting. So while this should fit right in between, this piece actually kind of overlaps a little bit too much with my seam allowance, so I'm going to trim it a little bit shorter to make sure that it fits just in between those edges and lays flat inside of that groove. Okay, so trim that down just a little bit. Now it's ready to sit right in that groove in between the 2 seam allowances on that side. So again, we'll take now this front sashing strip that's already attached to one side of our block. We're gonna press that over. You can press that with the iron, or you can kind of finger press it, whichever way works for you. I'm going to turn this so I can see it a little bit easier to make sure that it's overlapping with my stitch from the other side. And then I am going to add some pins here to help keep that edge just where I want it. When you're top stitching this side down, if you're using a straight edge or even a zigzag, go slow. Make sure that you're just paying attention, being careful as you pull those pins, keeping those edges aligned as evenly as possible, covering that previous stitch line, seam line, so that everything fits together the way that you want it. Now that I've top stitched this edge down, you can see I've got my whole row of 3 all added together. And again, I want to make sure that I'm quilting these sashing strips before I go on to the next moves. This first strip I haven't quilted in that design space yet, and it got a little bit twisted on me, so you want to make sure as you go you're kind of adding those quilt stitches here in those sashing pieces as you start adding them together to keep them all aligned and all nice and smooth with those batting strips on the inside. So far we've had a row of 3 blocks adding our 2 inner front sashing and back sashing pieces. From the back side, this is where it's starting to look. I've got different colors of my backings, but the same back sashing strips to come together to kind of tie the back side all together. So now that we have our 3 blocks all together, and we've got our sashing pieces stitched and quilted so that they also have quilting going all the way through those pieces, that'll help keep them where they need to be and those right lengths, those right sizes. Now we are going to add our outer edge front sashings, our outer front sashing pieces, one on either side, to finish out the length of this row. And these outer pieces, remember, they're cut at 3.5 inches by 12.5 inches. They are not going to be folded the way the inner front sashing pieces are. These outer ones are going to stay unfolded to go with it. And we also have our back sashing pieces as well, cut to those same sizes. Actually, I think I cut one a little bit extra big, but that's okay, because if it's a little bit bigger than 3.5, we can trim it down. I'm not too worried about it being too big at this point. So just like we did our inner front sashings, to join the outer front sashing on the left-hand side of my row, I'm going to flip the block again so I can see the back of it. We're going to attach that back sashing piece the same way we did with our previous pieces, so right sides together along the back side of this block. And again, I'm going to put a couple pins just to hold that in place before I flip it to the front. So back sashing in, and now I'm going to take my outer front sashing, and this time it is going to go right sides together with that same edge of the block, again making a nice little quilt sandwich here to come together. That way it'll hold all of those layers, back sashing the block and this outer front sashing piece to come together as well. So once it's pinned, I'm going to go stitch, quarter-inch stitch down this side as well. So like before, I'm going to remove those pins. You can see I'm just kind of finger pressing first this back sashing piece open. I'm going to take that over to the iron and give that a good press so it's nice and smooth and flat. So now we have those pieces pressed. We'll take our outer front sashing, this batting piece, to be the right size. So because we are on the outer edge of the quilt and we have just this one wide piece, we don't have a secondary seam over here to make our nice channel for the batting. So we're just going to be very careful as we lay our batting right up to the edge of that seam allowance. Kind of smooth that nicely in place. Bring that front sashing over top. And I am going to put a couple pins here because it is open on one side. I'm going to kind of baste through all of those layers. And that way it'll be sure to hold the front sashing, the batting, and that outer back sashing all together. That way so it'll be nice and smooth when it is quilted. Now again, this batting is going to be a little bit hanging over this outside edges. That's fine because we can trim that down. We want the batting to be just a little bit rounded up to that nearest inch so that it doesn't shift too much or get away from us as we're doing our quilting in these sashing pieces. And now I'm going to quilt this piece here. I'm probably going to use some straight lines, I think, in these outside edges to contrast the free motioning that I did in my inner sashing pieces. So I think I might just do a variety of straight lines to add some dimension and detail for the quilting as well. But feel free to add any type that you like. If you just want to do some vertical straight lines, or you can do horizontal ones, you can do them on an angle. I might add a little mix of varying angles of lines. You could also just do some free motioning designs. However you want to stitch that in here, go ahead and do that. So when you're ready and you have your pieces, your other end quilted, we're going to take our outer front sashing for this end and a piece of back sashing for this side as well. And we're going to join them the same way we did the other side, our other strips. Flip the block so we can see the back side. Take our back sashing right sides together with the backing edge of this block. Put a couple pins there to hold it in place. And then we'll take that outer front sashing piece and lay that right sides together with the quilt top. And I'm going to put pins all the way through those layers to hold all of that together. We'll stitch it with a 1/4 inch stitch. Once we have the last piece for this row added on, we'll again take a piece of our batting. We've pressed our back sashing so it's nice and smooth and flat here. We're going to take our batting and lay it so it butts up right against this seam allowance edge to stay in there. We're going to fold that outer front sashing across it. Give it a press. I'm going to again pin baste through all 3 of those layers. And once both of these outer front sashing pieces are quilted, then this row is complete. So we want to go ahead and make sure all of those pieces and parts are properly attached and quilted together, and then we will have a row complete. Once the first row is complete, you'll want to just set that to the side. We'll join row number 2 in the exact same manner. We'll start with our leftmost block and the center block and one of our inner front sashing strips. Again, these are the strips that are folded in half with the right sides facing out. Have our backing strip. We'll fold back the right hand edge of that block, first block. Our backing strip, right sides together with the back side of the block. Put a couple pins in there just to hold that in place. Turn it face up again and take that inner sashing strip, the raw edges of that strip to the raw edges of the block. Again, making that sandwich of inner sashing, block, and backing fabric. Once that seam is stitched, we'll press the backing strip flat, and then we will take the center block and flip that side so we can see the back side of that block. Just like we did on our very first row, bring that backing sashing strip, our back sashing, to be right sides together with the center block. We'll put a couple pins in place here. And again, we'll stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. Again, we'll press from the back side to make sure the back side of those blocks to make sure this back sashing strip lays nice and flat after it has been stitched. And then when we flip it back to the front, on top of the back sashing strip, we will add one of our batting pieces. So it fits right into that gap between our seams. We will then flip that front sashing all the way across so that it covers over that stitch line on the next block. We'll pin that in place and then top stitch that edge down, and then we will add quilting throughout that strip. So once those first 2 blocks are joined and we've quilted this inner front sashing, we'll add the next round of back sashing and inner front sashing to the center block. Press that back sashing open so that we can then join it to the edge of our 3rd block in the row. Again, we will press that back sashing from the back side to make sure it's nice and flat. Now that it's joined to the next block, we will add in our piece of batting and continue folding in those strips and adding our quilting on that second inner front sashing piece. Okay, once again, we've quilted this inner front sashing piece. So now we have our 2nd row blocks joined together, and we will add our outer front sashing pieces to the far left and right ends, which means we'll also then be using our backing strips for these outer edges as well. So just like before, these go on the same way, backing, sashing right sides together with the block itself. Pin that in place. And then from the front, we add our outer front sashing, which remember is not folded in half, it's just a single piece. So this will go right sides together with the edge of the block. We will pin this in place as well. Again, through all of those sashing block layers. We will stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, now we have both of the outer sashing strips added to the edges of our block with our backing sashing and our front outer sashing pieces there. So this is where those wider strips of batting again will come in. So we'll make sure that our back sashing is pressed nice and flat from that seam. We'll add our batting piece right up against the edge of that seam allowance as well. And then we'll fold our front sashing across it. Remember, we want our batting to hang out just a little bit around those outer edges in case anything gets pulled in or shifts a little bit while we're quilting those pieces. And so on this row, just like I did on the first row, I'm just going to be stitching some straight lines at different angles into my outer sashing strips, and that way it'll be similar designs on both rows of these outer sashing pieces and similar details. Add a little bit of variety but still keeping the theme united together into those rows. So quilt it however you would like to come through And once you do one side, make sure to quilt the opposite side of that strip and add that in there as well. And then once you have at least 2 rows together, we'll show you how to join 2 of those rows, and you'll be on your way to joining all of your blocks into rows into one final quilt piece. Once you have 2 rows completely stitched and pieced together, quilted the inner sashings, these outer sashing pieces as well, you're going to want to make sure that we're trimming the edge where we're going to join these 2 rows together. So that would be this edge on this strip and that inner edge here. We're not trimming a whole lot. This is just to help trim out those extra batting pieces that have spilled over the edges. You can see on this top strip, I haven't trimmed all of that out yet because I'm not ready to attach this side, focusing on these inner pieces here to go with it. Once you've trimmed those rows, you want to make sure that we're measuring across those rows, both pieces, both rows, all the way across. You can use a big tape measure from one end to the next. Make sure that you're measuring across there as well as the other row. We want to make sure that those are within the same ballpark to go through. Our goal is about 46.5 inches. That's what my rows just about come out to. I think one is maybe just a hair past that 46.5. It's maybe 46 5/8. I'm not too worried about that. That'll be close enough for the seaming, but you do want to make sure that they do match up in size. Part of that is so that your edges, these outer edges that we've quilted, this is where the binding is going to go on these outside pieces. We want to make sure the rows equal each other. Whatever your rows end up measuring in length, that's the number that you need to go with. So if it's 46.5, like mine, like our goal, perfect. If it's something a little bit over, a little bit under, perfect. Use the number that's relevant to your quilt. And that you're going to cut your inner sashing strip to be that length, as well as your backing strip sashing. That strip again is going to be measured to that same length of the rows of your quilt. So we are going to join this the same way that we've joined one block to the next. But now that we've got these longer stretches on our blocks, I'm going to flip the whole row upside down, take my back sashing strip right sides together with the block edges. So just the way we joined our rows together with one block to the next with our back sashing, I've flipped my second row upside down and I'm placing my back sashing right sides together with the back side of this row. Because I've cut this piece of sashing to be the same length as my whole row, I want to make sure that those edges match up, and I'm going to put a pin in each of those end pieces first. And then I'm going to I've added a pin in the middle, I'm going to add an extra pin in the middles of those to make sure that I'm holding this layer appropriately together where it needs to be. When we're joining these long strips, these rows together, the more pins, the easier it will be to keep all of those pieces together. So now that I've got the back sashing, I'm going to flip this strip right sides up again. Make sure that lays nice and flat, and then I've got my inner front sashing piece. Again, this is a piece that is folded in half, so we have that nice crisp finished folded edge. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to line that up along this top edge to sandwich the inner sashing, the block rows, and then that back sashing strip all together. We'll pin it in place, and then we will stitch that whole side all together. Once you've stitched that together, you can see we've pressed our back sashing from the back side to make sure that's nice and flat. This is similar to how we've joined our blocks all along, so it's the same method, just longer seams here, so we do want to be careful that we're lining things up appropriately, using enough pins to hold everything in place. Again, using a walking foot to stitch these seams, if you have one, is going to be really handy through all these layers to keep fabrics from shifting too much in any direction to go with it. So once that back sashing strip is pressed, we're going to join it to our other row. So because this is so long, I'm going to flip it upside down, and I'm going to match this so that I know this is the right angle that it's going to go on. and then flip this back over to make sure that it's going to line up along those edges. So I'm going to line up from the ends again and add in pins to make sure that this goes the correct length. Once you've pinned your rows together, we'll stitch it together. We've now joined those 2 rows together. We've pressed our back sashing to make sure it is nice and flat from the back side. And we've got our front strip to pull over. So then, just make sure that's pulled the right way. I've got a strip of batting that's going to go into this channel, just like we did joining our blocks together. We want to make sure that it gets smoothed down in there, all the way down. Now remember, this batting strip can go a little bit bigger than the length of the rows so that it makes sure that it fits and it doesn't pull in or shrink in a little bit with the quilting stitches. So like I said, my rows were 46.5 inches long, and I've cut my batting probably about 47.5, 48 in length, just to make sure that I had enough that will fill and fit in that spot. Because again, I can trim those outer edges of batting later. Okay. So now that that batting is laid in there nice and smooth, I'm going to flip our front sashing piece over to cover. So you can see I'm starting my pins from the center here, making sure that I'm pulling my sashing strip across to cover the seam that we just stitched to join our blocks together. And I am putting a lot of pins. Some of you might think, oh, I don't need pins. It's fine, I'll just put a few in and that'll hold it. Because we've got all these layers, we do recommend a lot of pins just to make sure that that's held in place and secure, so that once it goes over to your sewing machine, you know that that top stitch will be in the right place and nothing will be shifting crazily on you. So take the time to make sure it's lined up. If you need to add extra support by your sewing machine, maybe another table or your ironing board brought down to the same level, just to help hold all of the quilt as it starts to come together, an extension table, anything like that, to keep it from dragging too much on the machine. That is also a good tip, a good plan to have as well. And now we're ready to top stitch this edge down, just like we did on our previous sashing strips. And then you'll want to quilt this sashing strip however you choose. So now we have joined 2 of our rows together with our sashing strip. When you turn it over, you can see our back sashing strips coming across as well. So you'll want to just continue building your rows, making those into those long strips before adding them onto the next pieces. You can also wait and join the next 2 rows together before you join the 2 halves into their places, and then those final outer border strips. Can't wait to see all of your fabulous quilts.